Oh, I remember Dungeons and Dragons in about 1977, somebody saying, there's this new board game-like thing from America. And I never really got into it, and I feel deeply ashamed because I should have done. But the way I got into it, it was that when I left school, I was sponsored, I decided to read mechanical engineering at university, and I got a fantastic sponsorship from Ford. And at that time, the British car industry was in a terrible state, and the government were after engineers that could be managers as well. And I was lucky enough to be part of what was called the special engineering program. So they gave us media training. Because we were going to say great things about Ford. I went to law school, went to accountancy, went and worked in Bordeaux for 6 months. It was really to try and give us a very broad scope. And I'm really guilty that I then left Ford when they'd put so much effort in. And I'm so sorry. But thank you, Ford, for that amazing opportunity. But there was a friend of mine that was on the same sponsorship as me, called Richard Turner, and we became friends. And I remember very well, actually. I just remembered this just the other day. I invited him to come for a run with me, and he said, "Great." So I knew he wasn't going to be very fit, but he came over and we went for a run. And then, a couple of days later, he said, "Should we go for another run?" I was a bit surprised. So I put my running things on, and he arrived in his car, and he said, and this is an English pun, he said, "Right, we're going to go for a run in the car to the pub, and we're going to play Space Invaders." So, there's an expression in English, I take you for a run in the car. And we played Space Invaders together, and we'd even work out the best pubs that are, because different parts of the UK had their pubs closing at different times, so we'd go between counties to play Space Invaders together. And he said, "Look, I've just started this company. I've disassembled the ROM of the Sinclair ZX80, and I want to write some games. And, you like telling stories. Why don't you write an adventure game?" So he invited me back to his house in a city in the east of England called Hull. And in his bedroom, he'd been, writing games. And he had a TRS-80. And we started playing some TRS-80 games. And one of them was Scott Adams' adventure games. So I owe Scott Adams a huge debt of gratitude, because he said, "You could write these." I said, "Yeah, I could." So I started writing adventure games, and that was it.
Awesome. As you said, you're adventure game specialist, or that's what I say. And
thank you.
A few years ago, everybody knew that adventure games are dead.
Yeah.
Do you think it is possible that the resurrection of the genre is thanks to mobile phones, smartphones, and tablets?
No, the most powerful reason is the move from physical distribution to digital. Because ultimately what happened, and we have a great relationship with Sony, they're fantastic, but they killed those subgenres like the adventure with PlayStation and the success of PlayStation. And the reason that happened was because retailers were so excited by the success of PlayStation, and publishers were obsessed with the fact that actually PlayStation audiences just wanted 3D visceral games. That they only commissioned very Me Too games. The retailers were making so much more money from PlayStation than PC that they reduced their PC catalog, and they were only then supporting and retailing the biggest PC games, and adventures just dropped out. And so what then happened was that without the ability to have retailers stocking the games, there was no market. So they were right. Adventures were dead, and would have continued to be dead if it hadn't been for this move to digital, where effectively you have an infinite storefront. So I think actually the Nintendo DS did really well at reinventing adventures and bringing in a new audience, because they were so successful. And they had a huge marketing budget, because obviously the Nintendo DS was cheap, the Wii was cheap to produce, so they made profits from day one, while Sony and Nintendo were producing very expensive hardware and relying on the software to make a profit, which meant the Nintendo could spend a huge amount on marketing and did an amazing job. And then the iPhone came out, and that was truly digital, obviously with iTunes. And instead of the retail model, where effectively a developer was getting 7% of the price in a shop, against which a publisher would offset all the development costs and anything else they wanted to. Suddenly a developer could go directly and get 70%, so 10 times as much. Obviously the price was much lower, but not 10 times, you know, your margins were not 10 times lower. So basically it was this incredible resurgence of niche. Adventures are a niche genre, but they're a large niche genre. I mean, at the same time that publishers were saying adventures are dead, they were also saying the PC is dead. You know, and I mean, now you look back and it was a ludicrous thing to say. But it was because retailers stopped retailing PC games. They were really focused on... So to be fair to the publishers at the time, they said that because that's what they were seeing, but they didn't understand how it was going to change. And you know, the publisher that we worked with on Broken Sword 3 and 4, THQ, was at the time the biggest publisher in the world, and they were bankrupt within 2 or 3 years because the market changed so rapidly. And for companies like Revolution, small independent developers, we were in a position where we could hardly survive. And then overnight, companies like Apple came along with the iPhone and everything changed, and it was perfect. They provided a landscape. And initially when iTunes came out and when the App Store came out, you know, these publishers were going, well, we want 2 app stores. We want the App Store for publishers, and we want the App Store for all the independent developers. And to their credit, Apple went, why would we do that? What? And the publishers didn't have the power to leverage Apple to make that change. And that was a profoundly important part, because it meant that, you know, when we published Beneath the Steel Sky, when we published Broken Sword, we were part of the mainstream App Store, which had the publishers had their way, wouldn't have been the case.
But before this turnaround, were you afraid that you will not be able to do your games anymore?
Well, Broken Sword 3, which we published through THQ, they made a profit of about $5 million. To finish the game, we were being paid in dollars, and the dollar plunged against the pound. So we borrowed £200,000, and we never quite recouped. So we went forward with Broken Sword 3 with the publisher making, and this was our game that we pitched to them, the publisher making $5 million and the developer losing £200,000. So £200,000 is about $220,000, well, more, $250,000. So the relationship between publisher and developer was so broken that unless something changed, I mean, the reason that I loved working on projects like Doctor Who, on the Da Vinci Code, it was a huge pleasure. But I had to do it because we were losing money writing original games. And then when everything changed with iPhone, and to an extent the Nintendo DS, then there was a sense that Revolution could resurrect itself. But we had no staff. We effectively closed down. We didn't go bankrupt, but we closed down, and everybody was working from home. Well, there was nobody working. We were doing our own things. Everybody went off, and then slowly we came back together again as the environment changed.
Do you think the style of development or style of functioning of some company by like letting people go totally in a time when you got no project is good and sustainable?
Well, as long as it's an honest relationship, absolutely. Yeah. So if you have, you know, Activision letting go however many, I can't remember the number, but those were employees who expected to have a job. Mm-hmm. The way that we work is we have a core team, and it's a very small core team, and then we have an awful lot of freelancers, and we outsource as well. And that's a much more honest relationship because everybody knows exactly where they stand, and they know that come the end of the project, we may or may not, but come the end of the project, they might well go off and do something, because to work effectively as a freelancer, you have to be pretty good. So the relationship that we have with our freelancers is that for the project, they are contracted to us, and at the end of it, we need to sell ourselves to them because we really want the good ones to stay with us, and they need to sell themselves to us. So it's a much more honest relationship because we need to continue on both sides to be attractive to each other. And I really like that. I think it also gives a much more creative environment as well, because everybody's very keen that the project is successful, because one, they have a passion, but also in the end, it'll do their reputation good as well. And for us, of course, you know, we're very keen to promote the people that we've worked with and give them the credit for what they've done. And it does work much better. Having big teams of people, for outsourcers it's great, because then you can balance. But for developers it's tough. I much prefer the smaller, more flexible, the more nimble way of being able to call on freelancers as we need them, and you pay more, of course, but that's the way it works, and that's the way it should work.
So no depression among the team, no anxiety that they will lose their job in, I don't know, like 1 year. Everything is...
No, because broadly we contract. Some people are permanent, and some people come for a project.
In your career, you have done some science fiction games, some fantasy game, and of course a lot of games set in real world. What is your favorite setting? Is it the real world?
Well, I mean, to state the obvious, even science fiction and fantasy has to reflect back on the real world. It has to be sending a message as to what, and in many ways, science fiction and Beyond a Steel Sky is looking at society now and the problems and kind of reflecting it back, but from a different perspective. And as such, I really love that, because like, people are at the core of everything. When you go around the world and you see these amazing things, it's actually the people and the people that existed throughout history and the people that live there now that are interesting. And ultimately, I don't think, you know, if you're trying to tell a story, that is what has to be at the heart. Humanity, the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful.
When we speak about games, like particular games, who came up with the idea for your first game? Who wrote it?
Before Revolution, I worked for a version of Activision, not the same Activision now. And the tester was a fellow called Dave Cummins. And he would write test reports. And I remember him writing a test report about a particular adventure. And it was a pretty crappy adventure. And his test report was so much better written than the adventure itself. So when that iteration of Activision collapsed, I asked him to come and join Revolution, you know, which I was just founding. This is back in 1990. And he had a wicked sense of humor. And so I wanted to write more serious games, but at the same time, I thought that Sierra games like King's Quest were ludicrously self-indulgent. You know, the idea of King Graham from Daventry and all of these things were so crazy. So our early games were very much the idea of the cynicism of Dave and me, and I wanted the humor, but he created this sort of lunacy, and I created the more serious side, and that's very much where our early games came from. He chose to leave after Broken Swordu because we couldn't write point-and-click adventures anymore because the publishers weren't prepared to fund it, and that's what he wanted to do. So he went off and did other things, and then passed away, which was a great shame because it would have been lovely to have been able to work with him again. I mean, clearly we have wonderful writers that we work with now, but the initial DNA of the company was him and me working together. Sometimes, I mean, he was quite rude about me, you know, and that's fine when he left, and that's great. You know, and I'm not, and maybe with good reason, but certainly that was where that came from. I do like to say why the game was called Lure of the Temptress, though, because I mean, one of the things that I felt very passionately about was that women really were being depicted appallingly in video games. I mean, there's a lot of arguments now, but compared to then...
I remember the adverts.
Well, that advert for Frontier 3000 or whatever it was, that was disgusting. That was just disgusting. And so, you know, not for any reason apart from the fact, for respect of 50% of, you know, human beings, we wanted to write much stronger female protagonists. And when we wrote a game, it was called, its code name was Vengeance, which was, of course, a crappy name that we were never going to use. But I remember we were working with with a publisher called Mirasoft, which collapsed very shortly thereafter. But the head of marketing was a woman called Alison Beasley, who is now doing PR still, which is fantastic. But she phoned me up and she said, look, we need to come up with some names. Can you suggest some names? So I came up with a load of names. And at the bottom, I put Lure of the Temptress. Ha ha. And she came back and she said, we love Lure of the Temptress. It has to be called Lure of the Temptress. And I said, but Alison, there are two problems. One, there's no luring, and two, there's no temptress. And there was silence for a moment. She said, can you put one in? I went, well, I can, but it's going to delay the publication, and it'll... She said, well, to be honest with you, we think the game's a bit small. So why not rewrite the game and the story around a temptress and luring, and then we'll publish it 6 months later. So that was what it was, and that was why it was called. And I was a little bit embarrassed, because it feels a little bit sexist to have a game called Lure of the Temptress. But it was definitely driven by Alison in her role at marketing.
Beneath Steel Sky was your second big game.
Yes.
How hard it is to do a sequel for a game that is 25 years old, if I'm right, I think?
What a good question. Before even embarking on the design, I took advice from people in the industry who were fans of the original game as to what, as a fan, people would expect. Because clearly we are blessed with having a community who are very passionate. And clearly we need to make sure that they are happy with the vision that we're following. Because obviously we see it from a very different perspective. You can ask me anything about Beneath the Steel Sky and I will tell you exactly why we did what we did at the time. But what I can't talk about is why it was so popular. Because, you know, there's a journalist in the UK who lives very close called Richard Cobbett, who's got a extraordinary encyclopedic knowledge of every adventure game ever written. And, you know, for example, I asked him to write a report on what he would expect as a Beneath the Steel Sky fan. And we then went through a number of this feedback, and there were common ideas, and I found that extraordinarily useful. And the vision of the game very much was derived from that, rather than, I've got this great idea. I'd talked to Dave Gibbons about, you know, we really ought to do another one. And he'd been keen. We've been talking about it for a number of years. And he was super keen. But the thing about Dave is, the first thing he says is, I know nothing about the gameplay. So gameplay has to trump any ideas. So I will give you my thoughts and my ideas, but the gameplay has to supersede that. So he's never precious about ideas. And he's a pleasure to work with for that reason. And we've got a very strong vision for the game. I wanted to, in our first game, Lure of the Temptress, we created this idea called virtual theatre, which was characters walking around the world, talking to each other. It was very text interface based in that you could link commands. So you could say to your little helper, who's called Rat Pouch, tell Rat Pouch to, and then it would have all the verbs that were context sensitive, and one would be go to. And if you type go to, if you touch go to, then it would give all the locations that you knew about. And then you could either say end or and then. So you could link all of these combinations together. So you could give commands, and that blew people's mind. It was a really nice idea. The problem was that it was actually pretty hard coded. Each combination we had to program, because we just didn't have the systems in place to make it work. Now we're working in Unreal Engine. So we have behavior trees, we have renderers, we have marketplace assets that we can buy, we have marketplace software, and everything that we would have had to write ourselves, we can either get from the tool itself, or we can get as a plugin. And it means that we can really focus, for the first time ever, purely on the gameplay vision. It's extraordinary. And it means that, again, small developers who couldn't have competed in the big league now can, because it's all about ideas. It's not about having a team that's large enough to write a menu system and a UI system. I mean, it might sound quite naive, but we, you know, our very, very experienced, wonderful programmer, we asked him to take responsibility for the camera system. So we looked at a number of games, we came up with ideas, and we defined very precisely what the camera system was. And we said, you know, could you do it in a month? He went, oh yeah. I went, he can't write a camera system in a month, that's ridiculous. And a week later he said, right, it's finished. I went, how can it be finished? He said, well, you gave me all the parameters, and actually all the tools exist. We've now got our camera system. And the camera system was there. And it was extraordinary. So that's why that's another reason, everything is changing so fast. But such excellent, whether it's, you know, Unreal Engine or Unity or whatever else, the ability to self-publish, digital, infinite storefront, everything is changing so rapidly, which is why indie developers are in such a good position, because the big publishers, things are moving too fast for them to get a real foothold and dominate the market in the way that they did previously.
The fact that Beyond the Steel Sky will be published or launched on Apple Arcade, is this the continuation of collaboration from 2010?
To an extent. I mean, a lot of these people have come and gone, and new people have arrived. But the core relationship with Apple, the initial two people on developer relations was a guy called Paul Burford and David Currell. And we were super excited by Apple because, like so many people, we thought that Steve Jobs was a genius. And then when the iPhone came out, it was so revolutionary. So when Paul Burford phoned us up and said, you know, oh, I'm working for Apple. Really? He said, and you might have heard about the iPhone. It's like, yes. And he said, well, we're looking for games. We think that your adventures would work really well. And that was our turning point, because we were effectively insolvent. We were effectively bankrupt. We didn't go bankrupt, but it was like we had no money, we had overdrafts, and that was just a glimmer of light. And I remember very well, there's the Develop conference that happens in the UK in July every year. We were up for some awards, so invited David and Paul, and I kind of knew that everybody would have invited them, so it seemed silly. But they said, oh yes, please. I said, has nobody else invited you? No. So I invited them, introduced them to people, and built a really good relationship, because we actually published very, very early on the App Store, or it was part of iTunes then, but it was in fact, yes, it was iTunes. And then they asked us if we'd be part of a Starbucks program, and that worked very well for us. And then they asked us if we'd be part of the 12 Days of Christmas. Now, 12 Days of Christmas doesn't exist anymore, but at that time, for a few years, over the 12 Days of Christmas, they'd give away an app, they'd give away a film, they'd give away a music track. And, game, film, music track, and then it would... And I was really worried about this, because you had to mark the price at 0. So I was worried that so many people who were maybe thinking about buying the game would actually get it for free and then not buy it. But when Apple asks you if you do something, obviously you say yes. And it was an unbelievable experience, because we had 2.5 million downloads in one day. And then when we put the price up to full price the next day, our sales went shooting up, because what it was all about was about the exposure and the marketing and the word of mouth, rather than, I guess it should have been obvious, but it was so different from physical marketing, which is absolutely a zero-sum game. Whereas digital marketing in a global market is all about win-win. And everything had changed. And so in marketing, in sales, the relationship is not about selling things to individuals and trying to get the best price and then working out where the value is on the chain. It's about obviously going directly to gamers and our audience and our community, and encouraging them and saying, yes, particularly on PC, we know perfectly well that you could pirate this game. We understand that. But we hope that we're making it, 1, affordable, 2, easier to buy than to pirate, and 3, that you understand that if you pirate the game, then we lose the revenue and we won't be able to write any more games. And you must understand that actually that is the way that the world works. And people respond really positively, and they want to buy the game because they know that that will then allow us to write more games that are similar. And they also know that if they don't buy it, then we won't. So it's a very honest relationship.
You've mentioned Da Vinci Code. Are you interested in do another game based on book or film?
Right. Well, the Da Vinci Code involves an American going to Paris, and he meets this younger French woman, and they almost get killed in an explosion involving the Knights Templar, which is exactly what happens in Broken Sword 1.
Yeah, it sounds very similar.
It does sound very similar. So our fans are convinced that a young Dan Brown must have played Broken Sword, and that that's where his ideas came from. I wouldn't like to comment. Obviously, his ideas did come from, maybe also came from, a lunatic book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which was just so far-fetched and just plainly wrong. And I think what's quite funny, at the beginning of the Da Vinci Code, it says, fact, there is an organization called the Priory of Sion. No, Dan, there really isn't. Well, there is an organization called the Priory of Sion, created by this nasty little man called Pierre Plantard, who claims to be the Grand Master of multiple secret societies and is a lunatic. And if you believe him, then honestly, you're not really doing your research very well, is what I would say, if he was to ask me, which he never has. But it is so much more satisfying creating your own stories and your own ideas. And then you're not beholden to anybody either. So if I can continue to write original stories and original games, then that is what I would love to do. But I did love working with the team on the Da Vinci Code, I have to say, because there were so many talented people. And I loved working on the Doctor Who project because it opened up new ideas, it opened up new relationships. The team in BBC Wales were wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And you know, and as a child, I used to watch avidly Doctor Who, although I have to say it was a lot more scary. For the time, it was so much more scary in the 70s than it is now. They're very, very cautious. The Autons, oh my God, the Autons were so scary. The Autons, I mean, are you Doctor Who fans at all?
Not so much, but I of course know, yeah.
Right, so the Autons, bearing in mind that I was maybe 8 or 9, or maybe less, 7 or 8, and the Autons were just plastic dolls. And when this woo, their eyes opened, and you had, and they'd stand up, and then they'd walk in this creepy way, and they would kill people. Like, as a child, any one of my toys could have been Autons. And my sister's toys almost certainly were Autons. So I wasn't sure, every time I went to bed, I wasn't sure whether I should close the door in case any of my sister's Auton toys came. But if one of my toys was an Auton, then I wouldn't be able to get out. So I'd have nightmares. I mean, really nightmares. And so, but Blink is a brilliant episode by Stephen Moffat. So, but the point is, it opened up this sort of new area of television collaboration with a very, very interesting, exciting, intelligent team that were excited by what we were doing, and it was great. But as I say, the reason I did it was because we were losing money on the games that we were writing ourselves, even though they were commercially very successful.
So, what do you think about these fights for exclusive between Steam and Epic Games Store? Because it's a big question nowadays.
Yeah, I know. All I would say is, you know, I've been writing games for a very long time. And when you have big companies battling it out, the only ammunition that they can fire each other is content. So as a content creator, it puts you in a really strong position. So, you know, in television, you've obviously got Netflix, Amazon, now Apple, and all the film studios. So it's a fantastic time to be a content creator for television. For games, it's also great because, you know, Steam had a monopoly. Steam, very, very, you know, benign. I mean, a great company. But by creating serious competition, it's healthy for the industry as a whole. And Epic, we're using Unreal Engine 4, so we already know Epic very well and like them. We have no plans publishing-wise. We will of course publish on PC, but we have no idea. The game is still 6 months off, so we have no idea what our distribution will be. But I would say that having competition between platform holders is good for good for the audience, and it's definitely good for content creators as well.
Probably the last question, can you tell us anything about the next Broken Sword? Anything. And I know that you will say...
Skipped, like Beyond the Steel Sky, we're not allowed to ask about things.
I'm going to give you a really boring answer. And I'm going to say I am hugely flattered that there's so much passion about what Beyond the Steel Sky and Broken Sword 6 will be. And it's a privilege to be able to create content that people really care about. So yes, of course I'm writing stories in my head and working out what it'll be. And because of the change in environment, what we want to do is we want to be super ambitious, but without alienating our audience. So we want to make sure that fans of the Broken Sword games will get a game that feels absolutely like a point-and-click adventure, and is a point-and-click adventure, but innovates as well. So it's drawing the balance between the two. And because now we're able to self-fund a large proportion of our own games, because we're able to self-publish, it means that we can take our time at the prototyping and the design stage without being rushed into creating something before it needs. And Beyond the Steel Sky, we took over a year before we even talked about it, because what I didn't want to do was announce this game. People would ask us, we would be obliged to tell them what we were going to do, and we hadn't even prototyped it. So we only announced it once we knew about the virtual theatre aspect, once we knew about the hacking and the ability to subvert the world and subvert the characters, and to solve puzzles based on subverting the world, rather than just simply a very static environment where you go and you use a pair of glasses on the sun to create a fire on a piece of paper, and that then means that everybody runs out of it because the fire alarm goes off, and a very static world which is responding simply to player actions. I wanted a dynamic world. It felt that's what we had in the original Beneath the Steel Sky, a more dynamic world where Lamb wanders around, he goes down in a lift, he does things, and he comes back again. That was the vision for Beyond the Steel Sky. For Broken Sword, it's it's a different audience, different type of people, different type of game. And also, because we've written them concurrently, then in a way, we have less scope to change. I think with Beyond the Steel Sky, because it had been 25 years, we had much more freedom to say, we really respect and love the fact that there's so much passion. We promise we will do everything we can to deliver what people want and people expect, but at the same time, we want to surprise you. We want to create something that you don't even know that you want, because that is our job. So I managed to talk for about 5 minutes without answering your question in any way whatsoever. And I'm afraid that's probably the way I'm going to have to keep it.